Good morning and welcome to this webinar brought to you by BIM Plus and Construction Management. This session is entitled Information Delivery Specification. What is it and how should you use it? In association with IdeaGen Mail Manager. Our program today. The Information Delivery Specification, or IDS, defines information requirements that can be read by humans and crucially interpreted by computers. The IDS helps all stakeholders to clearly specify information needs without ambiguity so the checking procedures can be automated. How can you implement IDS in your information management workflow? Emma Hooper and Rob Jackson will explain. In the second half of the webinar, IdeaGen Mail Manager will focus on how technology can enable collaboration only if it is procured. I've used the wrong notes there. We'll be talking about email management rather than that. I've put there. Apologies for that. There will be a Q&A session at the end. Let me introduce our speakers. Emma Hooper, Head of Information Management Strategy at RLB Digital, which is also Vice Chair of NEMA and Building Smart UK and Ireland. Rob Jackson, Head of Information Management Services at RLB Digital, and Chris Beale, Client Manager at IdeaGen Mail Manager. I'm Justin Stanton, Editor of BIM Plus. I'm your chair this morning. A bit of housekeeping before we dive into the webinar. Please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions. Please keep those questions relevant to today's webinar topics. You can pose questions as yourself or anonymously. Our panelists will address your questions in the Q&A session at the end. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch on demand via the original registration page tomorrow morning. There is 1 hour's CPD credit for those who complete this webinar live. CPD certificates will be issued tomorrow morning. You can only qualify for a CPD credit if you are watching via your own registration link. That's enough of that. Let's crack on. Emma, can you share your screen and open your mic and camera?
Okie doke. Is that okay? Can you see?
You're not on full screen yet, but I think we are now. Yep, perfect.
Yep. Right, must be a bit of a lag. Right then.
All yours.
Cool. So thanks, Justin, and good morning, everyone. So welcome to this presentation about IDS. And as Justin just said, my name's Emma Hooper. I'm Head of Information Management Strategy at RLB Digital, and we are a subsidiary of the wider RLB business, and we focus on external facing digital services. And then I have lots of other hats, part of that I'm Vice Chair of both NEMA and Building Smart UK and Ireland. And then we also have my colleague, Rob Jackson, who is Head of Information Management Services. So I look at the strategy side, whereas Rob looks more at the implementation side. So hopefully you'll see that coming through on our presentation today. And he is also part of the Building Smart UK and Ireland committee as well. So IDS. So it stands for Information Delivery Specification, and it's a solution that was developed by Building Smart International to capture information requirements in a machine-readable format. And it can be used for any model schema, but it is closely associated with IFC. And I came across it back in 2020 when I read the Building Smart Technical Roadmap, and it was officially published as version 1 last summer, with potential plans to also take it to ISO. So I'm going to talk about it, starting in the world of ISO 19650 to give it some context. So first, when we're looking at the information management process, we should define our purpose to identify and map out the tasks and decisions for a use case. And from that, we can then start to define what information we need for those tasks and those decisions so that we can actually fulfill them. And when we do this, it will be a mixture of things that we need information for. So that could be equipment, assets, possibly even other processes. And then the information that is then actually required for them. And this information can be a mixture of single properties right up to entire documents, as well as geometry that's also needed. And there will also be aspects of when that information is needed and who will be using it and supplying it. And all this has to be captured. And as you can imagine, this is all a bit of a mishmash with lots of duplication and possible contradiction. And this is what we do at RRB Digital. So we bring all of this together, rationalise it and structure it within a database so that it can actually be delivered. So when a project occurs, we then need to make the information requirements relevant to a project. So we've got them all in this database. So that can be done by filtering them. So based on things like use cases, object types, when that information is needed, and then who is going to supply it. And then this gives us exchange information requirements, or an EIR, which is then used for selection or tendering of suppliers so that they know what information is needed to be produced. But how do we issue that EIR in a machine readable format? And that's what IDS is for. So in essence, IDS is for the exchange of exchange information requirements, just like IFC is for the exchange of the actual delivered information. So let's go into IDS in a bit more detail. So IDS is made up of these three main parts. So we've got description, applicability, and selection. So description is the human readable part where you can add what the specification is about and what its purpose is. Then next is applicability. So this identifies what things in a model the requirement is applied to. And then selection. So this defines what information needs to be associated to the things, and it provides constraints. So here's an example. So we have a specification that all pumps must have a property called pressure associated to them. So for the description, that could be handover information for work stage 4. The applicability is that the specification applies to all pump objects, and the requirements are that the pump objects must have the property of pressure associated to them. So let's see how we can use IDS to actually define this. So we can describe applicability and selection by assigning facets to them. And there are 6 facets in IDS, so that's entity, attribute, classification, property, material, and a relationship called part of. And within these facets are parameters. So you can actually start to specify values, and you can also apply a thing called cardinality rules to both applicability and selection. So you can actually say if applicability or selection is required, optional, or not allowed. And this then is the fun bit. So what you can actually do is you can start to mix and match the facets across applicability and selection. So let's take this example. All pumps must have a property called pressure. So for applicability, we take the entity facet and say that the name must be IFC pump. And for the requirement, we take the property facet and say that the name of the property is pressure, but we keep the value blank. So that's a nice simple requirement. But that's only the beginning. We could add another facet to applicability. So for example, this time we can also say that all pumps with a uniclass classification of PR 70, 67, 37 heat pumps also need to have that pressure property. So it's making the applicability much more specific. And if we wanted to, we can create a range for the value of the pressure property. So for example, if the value needs to be between, say, 7 and 150, we can create a complex restriction using a syntax called regular expressions, or regex, to express them. So a great example of using complex restrictions is for naming conventions. So we can actually start to capture nomenclature within IDS. And there are loads of combinations that can be covered, and I actually think it's a really elegant and simple solution. But IDS doesn't cover absolutely everything when needing to capture information requirements. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But IDS is actually serialized and put into a file format using XML, and this is what it actually looks like. So you can actually see the applicability and the requirements. And in this example, it's for all actuator types, and the requirement is that the name must follow a particular pattern. So that whole nomenclature thing that I've just talked about. So if we go back to information requirements, this is what they look like in a simplified way. At the heart of things are the objects, and then we have the information associated to them described using the level of information need. So we've got geometrical, alphanumerical, and documentation concepts. And then these can then be associated with milestones and actors. And then this is how IDS aligns. So objects is the applicability, and the level of information need concepts are really the requirements. And when people say that IDS only does alphanumerical requirements, that's not entirely accurate, because IDS can capture materials, which is part of the geometrical requirements. However, capturing other parts is a bit more complex, and that's currently out of scope. That said, IDS does do alphanumerical requirements really well, and with the added functionality of complex restrictions, we can bring more of what would be in the information standard in as well. So really it does capture a good chunk of what we need in the here and now. And remember, this is only version 1, and I'm sure there'll be further improvements. Information requirements form a complex data model, which is why a database is the best way of capturing them, especially with a sheer number of individual requirements. On projects, you can have like up to tens of thousands of requirements. So in reality, it would take a while to create an IDS by writing them by requirement. So this is why we believe that IDS really should be an export from a database, and this is what Rob's going to be talking about in a bit. So you might be thinking, well, why do we need standardized information requirements for Exchange? Well, because they need to be combined. So in ISO 19650, the lead appointed party should incorporate the appointing party's EIR into their own information requirements before selecting their suppliers. And if we have different data structures, then this is difficult to do, and we've got another interoperability problem. And also, if we want standardized information requirements across industry, again, they all have to have the same structure so that they can be merged to create different sets. And in terms of industry use cases, there are many projects happening currently within Building Smart to create information requirements using IDS. And these are some of them which are happening or already have happened. And when completed, these should be available on the Building Smart use case management tool. And then we have COBE, which really is an IDS for operations and maintenance. So as well as information requirements, IDS has 2 other functions. So it can be used to configure the IFC export settings within modelling software to create an IFC that meets the requirements. So there would be less manual updating of configuration files. And then it also provides open rules to check the delivered IFC model against the information requirements. So it opens up new ways of checking models. But with checking though, you still need to be able to check using other methods. So you need to be able to check things like duplicates or correct space boundaries, as these are important for data checking. So bringing it all together, using IDS, we can specify, configure and check the delivered IFC models against the original requirements. And this provides a really robust method for making sure the requirements are met. And this makes exchanging machine-readable information much more efficient. And having a data dictionary as a foundation provides consistent classes and properties throughout. So you've got the Building Smart Data Dictionary. And then any issues during checking can be reported back to authors using BCF or BIM collaboration format. So it's that one practical workflow. And if you want to know more about IDS, then Building Smart International website is your starting point. So there's some good sort of basic information on that. But then if you want to delve into the technical detail of IDS, then there's some really good information on GitHub. And I must admit, it is actually really well structured and easy to follow. And I just wanted to explain the difference between IDS and the IFC validation service also provided by Building Smart. So IDS is for checking an IFC model against information requirements. The IFC validation service is for checking an IFC model against the IFC schema. So it's checking the structure of the data model, not the contents. And to finish, there is also a list of software that currently supports IDS using this link shown on the Building Smart website as well. And this is kept up to date. So that's me. And with that, I will hand over to Rob. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma. So just to sort of start off a little bit where Emma left off, I wanted to kind of go through the process I've kind of followed to try and build a database, as Emma talked about, and a little bit about how we kind of pass the IDS file for the checking process. So as Emma mentioned, the Building Smart website has a set of documentation around IDS, and this was my starting point for kind of building the database. Behind that is GitHub, which is not my favorite tool as a kind of user in terms of kind of look and feel, if you like. It sometimes feels a little bit alien and feels a little bit like you have to be a computer program to understand this. But as Emma said, the actual sort of ordering of this, once you get a head around it, is actually relatively straightforward. There is a whole sort of set of README in the user manual, and I'll just open one of these just to kind of show you what this looks like. So the IDS file itself has basically a header of information. So think of this as like your title block on a drawing or your front sheet on a document. The important bit about this, and one of the things I learned through this process, was that these fields, when you're particularly in the header, for example, need to be in the right order. If they're in the wrong order, then your IDS file is invalid. So even trying to structure the information consistently is really important. And then also understanding the content of what some of these fields required. So for example, the author needs to be an email address. And so kind of putting your head into some of this detail and trying to understand what does this mean is important. Now, there are some very good IDS delivery tools out there that you can write IDS from. But as Emma said, IDS is really an export from a set of information requirements. So what I'm going to show here is a tool called Morta. So morta.io is the tool that we're using to show the database. In reality, you could swap this process out for other databases, and then you could apply an export to IDS. So this is just a database that proves the point, and we know this works for what we need to do. So our starting point for this really is to, I guess the goal is to write a set of exchange information requirements. Now, as Emma said, those information requirements are made up of documentation, geometrical and alphanumerical information. And what we're largely focused on is the alphanumerical information. Although, as Emma pointed out, materials, for example, technically are part of the geometrical. So what we're trying to produce here in old school is a document. In reality, is probably a document plus a spreadsheet. And one of the considerations that we did think about was IDS is great for sharing with machines and being able to import it, and also being able to author using it, but actually also need this information in contract. And is an IDS going to be sufficient to do that? So there are some considerations that IDS isn't just the point, the only thing that you're trying to create in this process. So this is the output that we're trying to build. Now, behind this, there are a series of tables. The first of these is the metadata, which I've just kind of showed you an example of. And again, that author being an email address is important. Now, at the moment, we're not using this data. I created this table to ultimately push into the IDS. I will kind of explain a little bit about what we're doing later on, but this is the sort of the header data that sits above the IDS itself. Now, as Emma pointed out, the whole kind of process is built around objects or entities, depending on what you want to call these. So we've built a library of entities built around IFC because we want to use the open standard sort of methodology. And this allows you to build around the IFC schema. So, for example, a pneumatic actuator is in the schema, but it also allows you in this process to even consider ones that are perhaps user-defined ones as well. So a good example of this, for example, is a louver that might not be covered in IFC 2x3. This ability to add to that list is there. So some people always think it's restricted or they make up their own terms. We still want to follow the schema in this process. The other thing to note when we built this kind of object library is that we also wanted to think about future-proofing it for other schemas. So generally we are using IFC 2x3 because it's well tested and well proven, but obviously things are moving on. IFC 4 has come out, now IFC 4.3, and this database of objects allows us to filter this and cut and carve it depending on which schema we want to use, or even potentially a mixture of those schema if it's right for a project. So the database has thought about this process of those objects, and we can expand on the user-defined ones, but this is largely to some degree fixed until later versions of the schema are published. Now, as well as the objects, we want to associate the data to it. And as Emma pointed out, there are various sort of elements to this, attributes, classification, materials, properties, quantities. And as Emma said, part of is also in there. So what we've got here is a library, essentially, of properties, attributes, classifications, and so on. And what this allows us to do is to select which ones of these we want to include. So in this case, we're saying we want to include the global ID, the owner history, the name, and the description for an actuator type. And we can go down and we can select whichever ones we want to include in this. Now, again, this is aligned to the various schemas. So again, we can choose which schema we want to apply to this and filter it first if we need to accordingly. We can also add our own properties to this as well. So again, some misconceptions about IFC is that, it doesn't work because it doesn't include what I need. IFC is not totally rigid in that regard. If you want to add properties to this list, you certainly can. Attributes tend to be kind of sort of settled in that. So you can see here some additional attributes, particularly around Kobe, as Emma mentioned, a purpose for why we want to get out the IDS in the first place. We can go through and we can select those properties to be included. So it's not completely set in stone, but again, it's a library of data that we can select as a starting point. And again, thinking about purpose to do that. Much of this data as well contains other metadata, which will ultimately end up in the IDS file. One of the things that I learned that IDS was quite sort of picky, I suppose, was that it actually wanted the entities in capitals, which originally this sort of database hadn't considered, and we had to make some changes to the database to make it work efficiently and effectively. Now, once we've then selected them, we can then filter the properties, the attributes, the classifications, and so on down into a single list. So this is the same list I've just shown you, but with a filtered version of it. And again, this is completely configurable, where this is just a default kind of position that's configured accordingly. And from there, we can then bring those objects that we set up and the data together. So for example, some data may apply to many objects. You may have a manufacturer applied to the boilers, to the chillers, to the air handling units. The data's in one place, the objects in another, and you bring those things together. Now, this essentially is my exchange information requirement. Again, it's a template. In this case, it will tell you for an actuator or an electric actuator, I want the name. It will then tell you which stages you want the name. Now, the stages themselves don't appear in IDS. You would create an export, perhaps for stage 4, one for stage 5, and one for stage 6. You can filter the database accordingly. And as Emma mentioned, you can also then start to define how you want that nomenclature to appear. So, we want the actuator to appear. And then I had to use, in this case, ChatGPT to figure out some of these regular expressions. Equally, there are some in here where I will need to go through and configure them. So this, for example, here is the zone naming. If the zone classification wants to be changed by the client, we can change that, providing we follow the syntax correctly in terms of how we set that up. So as you can see, I think on this particular table, there are 2,848 rows and an awful lot of columns. You'll notice these slightly grayed out columns. All of this is coming from the other tables. So it's not being repeated. I'm not sitting typing this all out. It's merely coming across. It's also linked to the Building Smart Data Dictionary and thinking about how that data comes together and really trying to standardize this process. And what we then do is, with that data we've created as a big table and a view, is we effectively show only the columns that we want to export for IDS. IDS obviously supports certain columns which need to be called certain things and contain certain data. And some of this data I'm still in the process of figuring out, have I put the right information into some of these columns as well? So some of this may change, but this is essentially what IDS looks like, almost in an Excel, but in a tabular format, essentially. Now, the next step with this is to move away from Mortar and to go to Power Automate, so a Microsoft product. Now, I have to thank Jad at Mortar for this process. He helped build this process, and I kept feeding back to him observations about it. What Power Automate does is it looks at the table, it looks at the view of the table, and then it starts to look through the data and basically works through a series of steps. I won't run this because it takes a little while. Goes through all of those columns and tables. In some cases, it gets a little bit more fun. It starts to go through multiple sort of looping over elements and so on. But ultimately, it will create an IDS file out of the back of this. So you're basically hitting, you hit test and you run it, and it will automatically create that XML file. Now, once you've got the XML file, you want to make sure it's valid. And again, part of the process that we've been through is to test it. And again, grateful to Andy Ward at XBIM for helping with this process. He has a tool, XBIM, which allows you to test the IDS process. You drag and drop the IDS, and you can test whether it's valid. One small note to note that I noticed the other day when I was prepping for this is that it does have a limitation on the size of the IDS. So again, splitting down some of the IDS for testing purposes is useful. Need to probably talk to Andy about that as well, but this at least allows you to check whether your IDS is valid. In the past, we've had criticism of IFC being, IFC is rubbish because it doesn't work. Sometimes that's because the IFC coming out of the tool wasn't great, and sometimes because the import wasn't great. So it's important that the IDS is valid before we start trying to import it into tools. Now, if you're interested in this process, and obviously haven't got the database, but you want to play around with IDS, there are IDS files on the Building Smart website. Again, just be careful, make sure you actually run these through XBIM as well to make sure they're valid. Some of them are based on slightly earlier iterations, I think, of the IDS schema. So it's important you test that process. And then just the last step of this process, just to kind of go through what we would then do, is we can then use tools to import the IDS file. Now, you may import this into an authoring tool like Revit, and that is, in the ideal world, you would bring this into a tool where you're actually creating the data based on the requirement in the first place. Now, as information managers, our job is actually to test the export effectively and make sure that the authors have delivered that. So the process is fairly simple in Celebri. It has a singular rule, and you load that in. And then what you can then do is you open the rule parameters here, and you can open an IDS file. And this IDS file here is the one I've just been showing you through this process. Now, one interesting bit about this import is that copyright is missing in this list. Now, at the moment, I haven't worked out if that's a Celebri issue, if it's an export issue, or it's an issue on my side. So again, words of warning with all of this, making sure tools can import properly and understanding where the issues is going to be, a challenge for users to make sure it's right. Let's not pretend it's all absolutely rosy, you hit export and it's all done. But you can see here what it publishes in terms of the information of the IDS. Now, once you've loaded the IDS in, it's really a simple case of hitting check model, and it will run through and create results in that. Now, again, this naming format of the rules comes from the database I've created, and I may change this over time to make it potentially more human readable. But at the moment, I wanted to structure this in a way that I understood what it was creating, and that was really important to me. And as Emma mentioned, cardinality is something required or not. In this case, service life duration in this particular property set is not being provided against these particular objects, and therefore these objects are failing. Again, I've got more work to do in terms of testing this process and making sure the data is coming across. And as Emma pointed out, IDS will be supplemented with other rules, for example, duplication, particularly in terms of nomenclature. So you can check a door number in a format in IDS, but you can't necessarily check that 2 door numbers are duplicated. So there is going to be a case of bringing additional rules to supplement the IDS for a period of time, but hopefully future versions of the IDS will enable you to add more rules to that process, whereby IDS becomes almost the de facto standard. So that's pretty much it from me, but hopefully that was useful to those watching.
Rob, Emma, thank you very much, in particular for that sort of warts and all of your journey so far, Rob. So if you can turn your camera and mic off, Rob, and then I'll ask Chris to open his camera and mic and share his screen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, guys. So I'm just going to share my screen.
Yeah, that looks good.
Fantastic.
Although your screen's just gone blank, or maybe just need to scroll on a page.
Can you guys see that? Okay.
I've got your background rather than your IdeaGen background rather than the actual presentation slides.
Okay. 1 second.
It was there initially. So with this audience, we'll have this sorted in a few seconds. You start thinking about your questions for the Q&A with Rob and Emma's presentation so far.
Okay, fantastic. Apologies for this, guys. Okay, here we go. So I don't think you can see me either. You can just see my background.
You can only see your background. It's gone, and I'm now we're getting your background again. Came up with the black screen with your name. No, and it's going to your background again. Now now it's your camera. We can see a blurred version of you. Now it's the background again.
Not sure how to fix this one.
I'm not sure if your colleague in the background, Stacey's got the...
Hey, Chris, can you just please log out
Yes,
maybe and
I'll rejoin
the webinar? Yeah.
That's be the best. Sorry, everyone. Give us about 20, 30 seconds. We'll be back up and running. Right, I can see you, Chris.
Okay, you can see me?
Yep, to see you. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm just going to share my screen. Apologies for that, guys. Let me know if you can now see the presentation?
Yep, perfect. Yeah, all yours.
Okay, amazing. Well, yeah, thank you, Emma and Rob. Apologies for that again, guys. In this part, I'm going to talk about how, good information support to the IDS is focusing on, more overlooked but crucial pieces for that puzzle, unstructured project communication, and especially by emails. So I am client manager at Mail Manager. I spend my day to day, meeting with people that are looking to manage their email management solutions better. So right now, the technology landscape globally is changing at an ever increasing speed. There's no different within the architecture, engineering, construction industries, or as we like to call them at Mail Manager, the AEC industries. I'm sure you guys have noticed that in your own work, technology is continually to rapidly evolve and drive the AEC to become a lot safer, cheaper, and quicker. But today, there are numerous examples of how new technology is revolutionizing the AEC sector, for example, including artificial intelligence and virtual reality in a lot more work. Now, it's no surprise that, with everything going on in the world right now, teams are either working remotely or in a hybrid environment. That's becoming more and more difficult to access project information. So, AEC professionals like yourselves, they rely on strong and consistent communication. This might take the form of pitches, winning clients, day-to-day communication with your colleagues, but there's currently over 376.4 billion emails expected to be sent and received globally in 2025. So this is a rise from 361 billion in 2024. Emails is the most used communication and collaboration tool across the world, but it's one thing most people manage differently. It creates a lot of risks for the future. So one of these risks comes in the form of project rework. A recent study we had actually found that about 80% of project professionals spend about half their time on rework. Poor communication, it costs businesses around $62 million every year on average. So they don't just waste time and money, but they do cause huge communication breakdowns within teams and your senior executive teams and stakeholders. So beyond lost time and budget, they can introduce serious health and safety risks, especially when critical information isn't communicated or properly recorded. So that's why with consistent, transparent record keeping is so essential, not just for project delivery, but for meeting structured information needs of the IDS and ensuring safety across the entire built environment. So we all know how much information is generated in a construction projects, reports, models, specifications, certificates, and lots of emails. The trouble is that, critical context, approvals, designs, they get locked away in a lot of people's inboxes sometimes. And when this happens, you do lose a piece of the picture that IDS is trying to make whole. So I did a Mail Manager. We ran a survey. We called it the State of the AEC Project Management Research Report. And it really just aimed to discover, the project management and collaboration challenges faced by these companies globally across the AEC. So our 2023 report surveyed 550 AEC leaders and explorers. First of all, how firms manage project information. Secondly, where they store it. And finally, how they go about retrieving that data when they face a legal dispute, for example. So what this survey also proved is, a lot how the industry has been affected by the current global economy. Things like cost of living crisis, supply chain issues, and a lot of the latest building regulations. So if we jump into the main findings of this 2023 report, firstly, the majority of firms have stated that they cannot easily access their project information. We found that actually 90% of the respondents were concerned about the accessibility and visibility of their project information. Over 1/4 of the organizations, they've said that they're at risk when staff leave the business. So our research has found that, more and more firms are now aware of the importance of filing emails as part of the offboarding process in comparison to last year. However, 28% still don't require emails to be filed, and it can become very difficult to retrieve. And unsurprisingly, disputes are continuing to rise year on year. So in our 2021 report, 63% of respondents, they experienced some form of dispute. Last year, that number rose to 91%. So we see it growing all the time. So if we actually look at some of these stats on the screen, considering around 28% of businesses do not have email filing as part of their offboarding process, and around 81% of firms, they use email as the majority of their project correspondence. So thousands of firms are still at great risk losing information. And for 88% of people that we did survey, their overall volume of emails had continued to increase in the last year. So the contents of those emails are more important than ever. 11% of those people are claiming it is now business critical. And on top of this, almost 2/3 of AEC businesses regularly need to retrieve emails from past projects. For many firms, emails and keeping them well organized and accessible is not often a consideration until things go wrong. And at the end of the day, they hold vital information, design decisions, product approvals, safety clarifications. These could be critical for meeting IDS requirements and ensuring that health and safety isn't compromised on site. So if we take a moment to really look at why IDS is important for construction projects today, first, it creates a single source of truth. So what that means is all your project information, whether that's specifications or approval, it's unified, but it's also accessible. So this reduces discrepancies, enhances reliability, and ultimately is just going to help everyone work from the same page. Secondly, IDS promotes consistency. So it's going to capture all the changes, all the decisions in one place, basically ensuring that all verbal agreements are backed up with documentation. That's essential not just for good communication, but for accountability. And finally, there's the matter of regulatory compliance. So this is increasing, it's non-negotiable. IDS plays a huge role in aligning regulations like Building Safety Act of 2022. It helps demonstrate that the right information has been created, shared, and stored. And this is critical for passing gateway reviews and safety inspections. So the stakes are high, and the foundation for meeting these requirements, it comes down on how well we manage, share, and retain our project information. So including emails, decisions, and documents that typically often sit outside these traditional systems. So if we're honest, when someone leaves a project or a team, their inbox might as well go into a black hole. A lot of key decisions and changes in confirmations, even safety critical sign-offs, they can often disappear. And it's a real issue, especially with the Building Safety Act and gateway reviews that are now demanding more robust record keeping and auditability. So imagine trying to trace back a fire safety product substitution without the email thread where it was approved, or if you're trying to verify that a client signed off on a design before it even went into fabrication. These emails, they're not just messages, they represent decisions, commitments, evidence, and unless you have a way of capturing them and tagging them, making them retrievable, you're going to be working with an incomplete data set, and that puts your IDS compliance at risk. So as I mentioned earlier, when a key staff member leaves a project, they often take their inbox with them, meaning important contexts, decisions, and attachments vanish too. Shared inboxes might seem like a solution, but in reality, they're a mess. No structure, no clear ownership, and very easily overloaded. And even when you do find an email, it might not be linked to the right project folder or metadata. So IDS requires a single source of truth for all concept project correspondence. It requires information must be delivered at the right time to support decision-making processes. And it also requires compliance and traceability of approvals, clarifications, and decisions. Now, all these things are compromised when emails aren't managed properly. So when you have that single source of truth, different teams rely on different versions of truth hidden in personal inboxes. If emails aren't archived, and they're not searchable, it's impossible to retrieve the right information quickly. And if you can't trace who approved what and when, then you're left exposed during audits or gateway reviews. So Emma and Rob, they explained how IDS formalizes what information is needed, when and by whom and in what format. But even if you meet all the structured data requirements, you could still fail a compliance check if an inspector asks you to produce a document that you're unable to find. So, really at its core, IDS is about creating a shared understanding, a single source of truth that only really works if all parts of the project, including conversations and clarifications, are accessible, not locked in silos. So that's where archiving email becomes not just helpful, but essential. So, what does good look like? Emails filed automatically against the right project, metadata that is applied so you can research by topic, contract package, or even decision type, a full audit trail, who's agreed on what and when, and retention policies that ensure you're meeting legal and safety obligations. So it's not about being perfect, but it's about being consistent, traceable, and prepared. So luckily for us, technology advancements are continuing to improve how we work. As I touched on earlier, AEC firms are increasingly using tech to boost efficiencies. The adoptions of new tools and industry standards has led to several benefits in the global AEC industry. A lot of them including things like reduced waste, improved collaboration, enhanced productivity, time savings, and really just overall increased technology adoption. Now, these advancements are improving safety across the industry, and they're providing a lot deeper insights into project workflows as well. However, while all this new tech and standards like the ISO 19650 are making our lives easier, they're really boosting the industry. We now have access to massive amounts of data, both inside and outside of our organization, that makes information management very difficult. This sensitive and often confidential information is typically stored in documents and correspondence, and it can often be quite inaccessible. So information is really the lifeblood of all project work, but only if it's well organized and accessible. And it's not an easy task, but what is the solution that we are proposing here? So you need a single place where all your project and client information is stored so you can see the complete picture of any given project you're working on. You need a single source of truth, also known as the golden thread of information, is a concept based around bringing all information together, ensuring everyone in the organization has access to everything they need before making any business decisions. So simply provides, better working methods and encourages more transparent communication. We found that it's helping organizations drive change faster without compromising on quality, and it ensures that all projects and client teams have access to the correct information they need when they need it. So managing project information in one place, it's critical to avoiding dispute. And when done right, it allows teams to use their time, resources, and knowledge, to make the right decisions. And the two easiest ways that we found to create a single source of truth is removing manual processes and increasing information visibility across the board. One thing to keep in mind is that if your single source of truth is not complete, then it can't be classified as the truth. What we've seen in our 2023 research report is that while firms are stringent about how their documents and contracts are managed, email is still the one thing that everyone's got their own process and everyone manages differently. So without the right tools and automation in place, Project teams are left to their own devices. Some people will move emails into other Outlook folders, while some will save information to their individual desktops, and others will simply delete information if they don't see a need for it any longer. So in all of these scenarios, that information is trapped in silos and inaccessible to the wider project team. Losing access to essential emails, or not including them in your overall information management strategy, it can prove detrimental to firms. So when emails are managed correctly, everyone in an organization now has access to the information they need to make the right decisions. And, it simply just provides a better way of working, it encourages more transparent communications, and again, just ensures that all team members have access to that single source of truth. Plus, it removes the responsibility of storing and managing data from one person or a specific department. So it's time to avoid all of these common email headaches that we see. Is this what we agreed? When did you tell us this? John's left the company, so I'm coming in a bit cold. All of these common things that we hear all the time. Now, this is where Mail Manager comes in, and the reason why we're presenting today. So I'm sure everyone in this call has heard of or even worked with Arup before. For those who haven't, they're a global consultancy firm. They've worked on design and engineering projects, including the Sydney Opera House, Queensferry Crossing in Edinburgh, and most recently, the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. So Arup actually built Mail Manager around 10 years ago. The reason being is that it had no control over how staff managed their emails. Yes, they did have processes in place, the try public folders, project emails, manual drag and drop, but all of these processes relied on an individual to remember how to do it. So the two main issues that they had is, project staff were either spending way too much time manually filing emails, dragging and dropping them, or they were spending too much time, digging around for old historical information when there is a dispute, or someone's left the project. So there was a chance that people would be able to find this data, but it would be extremely time consuming to do so. So Arup thought, what if we had a system where all project teams could have an automated filing prompt to just standardize that process across the business, and they also had access to one centralized location to search for all project information. So when they couldn't find anything that let them do it, so given the size of their IT team, again, Arup decided to build Mail Manager. Now, we do regularly speak to our customers about how email processes have benefited their businesses, and we hear a few of the same things pop up regularly. For Gensler, the key benefits of using Mail Manager, they're saving about 5 hours per week per person, in administrative tasks. And we've enabled Gensler to comply with many quality assurance and statutory standards. Ramble, they noted that Mail Manager means important project information is now accessible by the wider team. So examples where, even when people are on holiday or they leave the business, they're confident in the fact that they will have access to all the information years down the line, and it's now a lot more time intensive to file those emails. And then finally, for WSP, better email management processes means that they have been able to retrieve project information in seconds, and they find greater business efficiency as they can spend more time on real work and greater visibility by capturing both sides of the conversation. Now, all of these customer stories that you've heard, they tie back to these 4 key issues that we hear from businesses that are ultimately the reason they want to purchase an email management solution like IdeaGen's Mail Manager. So firstly, they're concerned about the consequences if they were to lose any important project information. Secondly, either them or their teams, they're spending countless hours searching for information that's contained in emails. Third, they're concerned that the lack of control and the communication is coming into and leaving the business. They feel like they don't have enough control over that. And then finally, information is trapped in people's inboxes, making it effectively unusable if we don't have access to that one person. So with Mail Manager, we give our clients confidence that any email that has been filed can be retrieved. Businesses can rely on any email in seconds. Your productivity will increase as you can find and file any email in seconds. And then finally, you have one central space for all of your project information. So consistency is everything. Having that centralized archive ensures that nothing gets lost. Every decision, every approval, every update is right where it needs to be. And by tagging emails with relevant metadata, Mail Manager allows your team to align correspondence with IDS categories just as easily as you would handle, CAD files or fire safety certificates. Now, I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to take you guys through a quick, 2-3 minute demo and show you how Mail Manager works. Just to confirm, is that all good for time?
Yeah, that's fine, Chris. Go on.
Perfect. Let's do it. So I'm just going to share my screen, guys. Let me know if you can see that. Hopefully no issues this time. So let me hit share.
Nothing yet. Yes, it coming up now. Yep, there it is.
Fantastic. So I'm actually going to move this. Okay, you guys can all see my Outlook, okay?
Yep.
Perfect. So going to give you guys a very quick tour of Mail Manager. Main purpose is to get emails out of individual emails where they're out of individual inboxes where they're trapped and only that person can see them. And we want to move them to your centralized filing location. So very commonly we work with just regular file servers, SharePoint or Procore, just to name a few. Mail Manager also doesn't hold any data. So simply a bridge between Outlook and your centralized filing location. All the data is held by you. So the two main parts of Mail Manager then, first is the automated filing, and secondly is the advanced search. So if I give you a quick example of the filing, first of all, let's take this example email here from Lucy referencing some drawings on this 2JCP project. Let's just say I want to respond to Lucy and ask her to go ahead with these drawings. I would definitely consider this important client communication. I'm asking her to approve some actions on the project. So I'm going to hit send and respond. As you can see, before even having to remember to file or think about doing any sort of manual drag and drop process, Mail Manager's given me this prompt. It's read the subject and the body of the email, looking out for keywords and project names, and it's already selected this location. Mail Manager also uses AI machine learning. So over time, these suggestions are just going to keep becoming more and more accurate with the more emails that you are filing. So you hit send, you get the prompt. It's then just one click to send that email to Lucy as normal. Mail Manager has now filed the incoming and the outgoing email together. So you've always got access to that full threaded communication. And you're also going to have a tag here just to let you know it's been filed. Now, a few other things to note. Mail Manager deduplicates any emails across the business, so there's no copies. And you can also file emails to multiple project locations at once if you've got an email that references a few different projects. Now, let's just say you're sending an email that maybe you don't want to file. You're going to have that option as well. You're also going to have a private location. So if I just send a quick example email, hit send, you get the prompt as usual. You can either just hit send only, send and not file, or if it's a bit more private, like a HR conversation, you can hit send and file to your private filing email. So that's how the Mail Manager filing works. It's designed to build a habit of filing one click as you work. So no user ever has to go back and spend a big chunk of time, from what we've just seen, a few hours a week filing emails. Now, finally, to show you guys the search, you access it at the top, you just hit search and then open new search, and it's going to take you into this tab. Now, this is now where you would go to search. You won't look in Outlook because that's just your email, and you wouldn't go digging through all of your project folders. You can now easily search one centralized location. So it's live and up to date
Sorry,
across the business.
Chris. We can only see your Outlook screen.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. I've just realized I've just shared it onto the search now. So you guys should be able to see the search.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, this is your centralized search tab. So you can see right at the top of the 2 example emails that we just filed. So it's going to present to you the incoming email, my outgoing, and the filed location. We use SharePoint here. And here is an example of the email that I've just sent to my personal filing location. So you've got access to all these filters here to whittle it down. So you've got the filed location, keywords, specific date range, if you need to go back and find something, who the email's from and who it's to, even whether it was including any attachments. So if I give you all a really quick example of how you would use these to get down to one specific email, we had a colleague leave the business about 5 years ago, and we had to go and retrieve this invoice. So I would start by filtering on the project folder. I'm looking for an invoice. So I'm going to put invoice into the keywords. The email was from a lady called Georgina, and the email has an attachment. So I'm going to include here emails with attachments. And you can see with just those few bits of information in just a few seconds, I'm down from 300,000 emails down to just the one specific email. And you can see the full thread here. And if you click open, what Mail Manager is going to do, you guys might not be able to see that, but it's going to pop up the email into the Outlook format and give you back the original email format where you can then access the attachment. So that's the power of the search. You know, it's really the time saver of Mail Manager alongside the filing tool. So yeah, that is Mail Manager, and that's the end of the demonstration. So yeah, thank you very much, guys, and any questions?
Okay,
do
thanks,
let me know.
Chris. We get Emma and Rob to open their mics and cameras, and we'll jump straight into the Q&A. So that's Emma and Rob with it. Yep, okay. So question from Vitali, who's written a couple of pieces about IDS for BIM Plus. For Emma and Rob, do you consider which MVD you are creating the IDS for?
So I was actually going to do a slide on MVD. We generally stick to just default ones, either coordination view for text 3 or reference view for 4. One of the reasons being is that Building Smart are trying to move away from MVD. In the traditional IFC sense, MVD goes much further than just information requirements. It's also about the relationships, the actual sort of structure of the IFC, and it's mainly much more for software implementation. So yeah, we just kind of use the default ones for that.
Okay. Simon Dean says superb from you two as usual. So worth noting. Can you use IDS without using the Building Smart Data Dictionary, which is then a sort of a related question to that later on, which I just saw, where someone asks about, can you elaborate on how IDS and the Building Smart Data Dictionary interact?
Yep, so in terms of the Building Smart Data Dictionary, yes, you can use IDS without using the Building Smart Data Dictionary. The Building Smart Data Dictionary is a place that stores, you know, the classes and properties, so that you've got a go-to place for, you know, so there's consistency across the industry, so people aren't naming properties in completely different ways or classes in completely different ways. So it's just it's like a dictionary. You know, you go to it to get standardized you know, term and a standardized definition. So that's what it's for. And in terms of IDS interacting with the Building Smart Data Dictionary, I think in some tools when you create IDS, you can actually have a link to the Building Smart Data Dictionary to pick your classes and to pick your properties, so that you know you're picking it from a more sort of consistent, standardized source.
Yeah, I just add to that as well that the once you click on the link, it gives you more information about that property. It gives you a bit more descriptive information, which you might not want to include in the IDS to sort of blow it up in in terms of size. So it's quite a useful thing to include in the IDS for authors who perhaps don't quite understand what that property might be asking for.
Yep. Okay. Okay. Can IDS be used without using IFC?
Yep, so I did mention this. Yes, it can be. It is, at the end of the day, just really defining applicability and selection, which could be used with potentially any sort of data model. But, you know, it is, you know, primarily being used for IFC at the moment.
So that was that one. Is IDS likely to feature in the review and subsequent changes to the 1950 standards?
So IDS does come up in a lot of standards conversations, but because it's not actually an official ISO standard, then it can't really be referenced as such in the standards. And there are other standards where there's an overlap with IDS as well. It's quite a sort of a cluttered area, but hopefully that'll become clearer in the future. But it is thought about. So.
Right. Okay. Okay. Quick couple of questions for Chris, then we'll come back to you and Emma with some more. This would apply to me, I think. Can I feed historic emails into Mail Manager, or does it only work with live emails post-implementation?
Yes, great question. So if you have emails already saved in specific project folders, you can map to those locations, and everything saved in those projects will now be searchable with the Mail Manager search you've just seen. You can also bulk file from Outlook and put them straight into the file server, and again, making them instantly searchable. So yeah, there's options to bulk file and also map, previously filed emails as well.
Someone's asked about duplicate emails, but I think you covered that in your presentation.
Yes, Mail Manager would deduplicate any copies, so they won't be taking up storage.
Okay, and how does it file emails? Someone asks, is it the subject title that's important?
So it will look at the subject and the body of the email. As long as you have a keyword that is, somewhat corresponding to the name of the project folder that you have in your file server, then that's enough for Mail Manager to pick up the correct project location. But like I say, over time, it will start to look at, even the recipients that are associated with certain projects and just start to suggest as closely as possible to, the project it believes you're talking about in the email. But obviously, having a subject line closely corresponding always helps.
Yeah. Do you supply live face-to-face training for Mail Manager? Charles asks.
So I'm sure it's a possibility, definitely. But with our implementation, once a client becomes a customer, then we will meet with them, meet with our team. We'll run multiple training sessions for all of the users going forward, before they use Mail Manager. But yeah, I'm sure that's something we can do as well in terms of like a presentation.
And you hinted or mentioned in passing about potentially confidential emails. So how does Mail Manager manage permissions and confidential emails and their attachments?
Yes, so permissions are mirrored to the exact same ones that you have in your file server at the moment. So, let's just say a certain project team can't access all the finance and the HR folders. It's going to be the exact same with Mail Manager. So they're only actually accessing the data that they already have permissions to see at the moment. So it will mirror your existing permissions.
Okay, thank you. Jumping back to Emma and Rob. So question from Margaret Saki. She missed the earlier part of the presentation. Can you confirm how IDS facilitates checking procedures that can be automated?
I don't know if you want to answer that, Emma or I, but I think we probably covered that in our presentation and demo. So I'd probably suggest watching the recording of the presentation, essentially, because that is basically the bones of what both Emma and I covered, really.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Everyone will get the link again this time tomorrow, and so it should be available to watch on demand tomorrow morning. Anyway, so another question. Someone says, so I've heard a lot about what IDS can't check. You mentioned geometry, but if I was to write down thousands of requirements for data, including formatting of that data, and that data needs to be unique named, for example, will IDS cover all of that? And if it doesn't, what do you do then, as you can't have IDS plus supplementary files, as it's already very complex?
Look, IDS is in version 1. It's a new I won't call it a standard, but it's a new mechanism, if you like, for sharing rules and requirements between different tools and different people. And it is missing some elements. So, for example, it can check whether a boiler has certain data on it, but it doesn't check that it's a boiler. So you've still got to do manual checking in that process to make sure that some of that, is correct. Obviously, the rule would go, well, hold on a minute, this data is going in, it isn't a boiler, I need to go and correct that to the author. It will do as much data, really. I mean, I would say it checks well over 90% of, I had something like 20,000 rules in Celebri. I reckon it checks about 90% of my rules. It will check any naming convention that you want, but what it won't check at the moment is the uniqueness of those names. And what I would do in my Celebri process is have some additional rules to cover some of those elements and some of those checks, whether that's using, again, schedules and tables to check that data, whether it's visually checking the data and looking at the IFC tree. There are different ways to do that. So over time, I think some of these, I know Emma's been talking to the author of IDS about some of this stuff, and even the author of IDS knows about some of these limitations. But a version 2 or a 1.1, whatever they want to call it, I'm sure will increase that. What we need to do as an industry, though, is start making IDS a standard of how we share most of our requirements and communicating those last bits. Again, our EIR would have the bits that are missing, and that's something we're trying to do, is make sure that we're not just thinking about the rules that are in IDS, but thinking about making sure we tell the authors exactly what we're going to be checking in this process, which we call acceptance criteria, effectively.
Yeah. Okay. Emma, anything else to add to that, or?
No, I think Rob covered that.
Oh, perfect. Can IDS be customized?
The IDS schema is standardized in terms of what goes in the schema. So, there are certain things you can include and can't include. And the tool that we showed with XBIM is a way of checking that validity. But in terms of the content of IFC, whether it's want to check for fire rate in a door or acoustic rating or whatever, you can customize it completely to include whatever requirements you need to that fit into that schema of information, essentially. So it depends. When we talk about customization, they're two slightly different questions there.
Yeah. And final question, probably more possibly for Emma. To be clear, what should come first, the IDS spec or IFC data? Chicken and egg?
Specification always comes first, because that's what's specifying what goes into the IFC data model, and that follows the ISO 19650 process.
You don't build a building and then check that it met the client's brief. You write the brief first, and then obviously you check against that brief. But yeah, you definitely, the spec is definitely first.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you, everyone. Conscious of time, so let's move to the final slide. So, as previously mentioned, so the webinar will be available on demand. It'll be probably tomorrow morning. For more on IDS, there were the links that Emma mentioned, or you can go to the link there for that the Building Smart UK and Ireland page on the We Are NEMA website. For more on RLB Digital, you can go to rlb.com as the URL is there, or you can, for more on IdeaGen Mail Manager, go to mailmanager.com to keep up to date on construction news and everything else within the built environment. constructionmanagement.co.uk. Simply remains for me to say thank you to IdeaGen Mail Manager for supporting this webinar, and thank you very much to Emma, Rob, and Chris for your time and input today. And thank you, the audience, for tuning in. Good afternoon.